So far, we've seen a couple of properties and methods that are available on arrays. Let's take a look at a few more that are useful. Now we're going to take a look at a few more methods that we can call on arrays. Now these are different than the ones we saw before. Remember, the ones before actually changed the values inside of our array. For instance, when we sorted our array, the actual order of the values inside of our array changed. However, these methods will not change the value of the array, but instead return either a new array or some other values. So these can be considered sort of safe methods that will not have side effects on your actual array, but instead return you some new information that you could restore into a variable if you wanted to replace it, or it could just be used to create a new variable. So earlier we saw we could use push to add a value to the end of our array, or unshift to add a value to the beginning. But what if you want to join two arrays together? So let's store a variable called x, and we'll say the array is 1, 2, and 3. We'll use numbers to be simple, but it could be anything. And we have a variable y, which is 4, 5, and 6. Now what if we wanted an array that starts with 1, 2, 3 and ends with 4, 5, 6? Well, we can call a method called concat, which is short for concatenate, which will join these two arrays together and return a new array. So we'll create a variable called z, and then what we do is we pick the first part of our array, which is x, and then we can call concat on that and pass in another array that we want to add to the end of x in our new value. Now this will not actually add the values 4, 5, and 6 to our array that's stored in x. Instead, it's creating a brand new array that starts with the elements of x and is going to end with the elements of y. So we're saying z pretty much equals x with y at the end of it. But again, it doesn't modify x or y, but just simply creates a new variable, which will be stored in z. So if we do console.log x, y, and z, we can see what all these variables contain after we call concat. So let's go back and refresh. We can see that first we console.log x, which is still 1, 2, and 3. Y is still 4, 5, and 6. However, we've created a new one called z, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now basically what we did here is we passed an array as an argument to concat. So you could think of, instead of doing y, we could have simply replaced it with 4, 5, and 6. And it would have returned the same value. So if we look back, we can see 4, 5, and 6 are there. However, instead of just passing an array, we could also pass different arguments to concat. And if they're not arrays, they will be just joined as though they were an array. So here we have a slight difference. Instead of passing one parameter, an array of 4, 5, and 6, instead we're passing three values as separate parameters, 4, 5, and 6. But the result is the same. So we could pass any number like 7, 8, and 9. And if we refresh, we can see that however many arguments we pass in, it'll continue to add to them. However, if any of the arguments are arrays, like an array containing 10, 11, and 12, if we refresh, we can see that instead of appending another array with 10, 11, and 12, it actually added the individual values 10, 11, and 12 to the final array. So we can either pass in simple values like numbers and strings, but if we pass in an array, it's actually going to take the elements out of that array. So it's a little bit smart about it. You just have to remember that if you're passing in separate arguments and one of them is an array, instead of adding the whole array as a single element to the final array, it's going to actually take the elements out of that array and add them in. So that's an easy way to join two arrays together, or two or more arrays together, into a new array. Again, remember this is a safe method in that it does not affect any of the arrays that you passed in or called concatenate on. So let's take a look at another method called slice. I'm going to comment this out. And let's create a new array called myArray. And to make it easy, I'm going to set its values to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So index 0 has the value 0, index 1 has the value 1, and so on. So what slice allows us to do is pull out a slice of our array. So let's say we wanted to pull out the values 1, 2, and 3. Again, this is not going to remove them from my array. Instead, we're going to get a new array that contains the values of our array from a certain start index to a certain ending index. So if I wanted to pull out this range right here from my array, we're going to pass it the starting index and the ending index. So we'll say var result equals myArray.slice, and I'm going to pass it the start index, which is going to be 1. We can think of index 1 as being right here before the number 1, and I want to pull all the way to here. So the ending index would be, let's say this would be 0, right before the 0, 1, 2, 3, but I want to capture the 3, so my ending index will be 4. So I'll be going from here all the way back to here. So starting from index 1 all the way to index 4, I want to pull out that slice. So if we do console.log result and we refresh, we can see it's pulled out the values 1, 2, and 3 into the variable result. If we were to increase this to start at index 2, the result would be 2 and 3. And if we increase this to 5, it would now be 2, 3, and 4. You can see as we change the beginning or end index for our slice call, it's pulling out different parts of our array. And if we changed it to a very high number, if the ending index is outside of the range of the actual values in our array, it just won't return any extra values. So this is a lot like how we pulled out a substring out of a string before. Again, my array is not going to change. Instead, it's returning a new array that has the values of that particular section of the original array. Finally, we have a method called join. And let's create an array called words. And this will be an array of strings, and each string has a word. And if we take a variable called result and call on our words array, the method join, and what we do is pass it a string that will join these together. So what this is going to do is actually create a string that contains all of the values in our words array, and they're going to be joined together with whatever we pass into join. So let's start with the simplest case, or a space. Space is most often used when using a join because it's a very common use case. So let's take a look. If we refresh, let's take a look at words, which is still an array containing 4 different strings. But if we take a look at result, is a single string that has the values that words has, but in between each value is a space. Now this could be anything. If we replace the space with a dash and refreshed and take a look at result, you can see now we get a slightly different string with dashes where there were spaces. And this could really be anything, including really weird things like maybe treehouse. This really wouldn't make much sense, but if we take a look at result now, we can see we still have the values. These are some words, but in between each of them is treehouse. Or we could pass in the empty string, which would just join all the words together without any spaces. So the join method works a lot like the split method, where split created an array of values out of a string, and join creates the string out of an array of values. So they're sort of complementary like that. One creates an array out of a string, and the other creates a string out of an array. Now let's put a space back in here and just see what happens with some other values. So let's put at the end the Boolean true. If we take a look at the result now, we see that it has true the string, and that's because it tried to call toString on true. Anytime it gets a value, it's going to call a method that's built in called toString. So if we take the Boolean true and call toString, it actually returns the string true. Now if we call toString on a string, it's just going to return itself. But we can see how this would work on other values like the number 123.4. If we refresh and we take a look at result, it adds in 1234, which makes sense. But if we add a function, for instance, again, it's going to return what the function's toString value would be, which is its definition as a string. So join really makes sense when there's a string, but remember that if the values aren't a string, the method that gets called on it is going to be called .toString. We'll see how this is useful later when we create our own objects, and we could implement a toString method to return a certain type of value if we ever need to turn our new objects into a string. But that's a little bit advanced and later. Just remember that when we call join, every element is going to have toString called on it before it's actually added to the string. Up next, we're going to take a look at one of the most powerful methods in JavaScript, the splice method.